The night Eliza Hartwell walked out of Ashmore Hall, she left behind 42 pounds a year, a boy who had finally learned to smile, and one cream-colored glove on the library table. She did not leave the glove by accident. She had stood in that library for a long moment, candlelight catching the spines of books she had read aloud to Thomas on winter afternoons, and she had drawn the right glove from her hand and placed it very deliberately on the green leather surface of the Duke's writing table. Then she had pulled her cloak tighter, picked up the small valise that held everything she owned in the world, and walked out into the October dark without looking back. She did not know. As the wheels of the hired coach turned onto the Ashmore Road and the hall's lights receded behind her, that the Duke would find that glove before morning. She did not know he would stand holding it for a long time, long enough for the candle to gutter down, long enough for the fire to drop to coals, long enough for something in its composure to crack in a way that 4 years of careful discipline had not permitted. She knew none of that. What she knew was that she had been replaced, and that the woman chosen to replace her did not love Thomas, had never tried to, and that the leaving had been required of her long before Lady Marian's offer of £100 made it official. 9 miles of road lay between her and the village of Calney. 9 miles. And then whatever came after. She had not taken the money. That is where this story truly begins. Though Eliza herself would have said it began on a Tuesday in September, when she first crossed the threshold of Ashmore Hall with a letter of introduction in her gloved hand, and the last of her father's debts settled just barely enough to permit her the dignity of a steady employment. The house was larger than she had expected. Most houses occupied by grief are. Edmund Vane, Duke of Ashmore, stood at the head of the entrance hall as she was shown in. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulder, with a face arranged in stillness so complete it might have been carved, and eyes of a gray so pale they held the light, without warmth, the way February ice holds the sky. He looked at her letter of introduction, looked at her, and said, "Thomas is in the East Wing. Mrs. Plum will show you." Then he turned and disappeared through a door that closed without a sound behind him. Mrs. Plum, the housekeeper, was a stout woman with capable hands and a face whose default expression was one of managed worry. She showed Eliza the schoolroom, the governess's room beside it, the back stairs, the kitchen passage, and the garden door Thomas was permitted to use on dry mornings. She listed these things in a careful voice, and then she paused at the door of the schoolroom and said, in a lower register, "The boy has not spoken much since Lady Ashmore passed. 4 years now. His Grace does not speak of it, and I would not recommend that you ask." Eliza did not ask. She put her valise down in the small, clean room that would be hers, looked at the single window that faced the kitchen garden, and began the work of making herself useful. Thomas was 7 years old, thin-wristed, and possessed of a watchfulness that sat on him like borrowed clothing. He was Edmund's ward, the orphan son of a cousin who had died at sea, and the household treated him with the particular care people extend to things they do not know how to love. He sat at his lessons with the patience of a child who had learned that patience was the safest posture, and he watched Eliza across the schoolroom table with the specific attention of someone trying to determine whether she too would leave. She did not leave. She read to him from a brown volume of natural history that had belonged to her own father. She showed him how to press autumn leaves between the pages of a ledger and label, each one in a careful hand. She let him sit in silence, when silence was what he needed, and she answered his occasional questions with the directness one owes a child who has already had to absorb more than his share of the world's evasions. By the 4th week he had begun on some mornings to come downstairs before she called him. The London season had opened in earnest by the time the Duke's household made its first appearance at a public ball. Lady Marian Vane, the Dowager Duchess, came down from her own London house to oversee the occasion. She was a handsome woman in her late 50s, with posture that could only have been achieved through decades of determined attention, and she wore her rank with the ease of something she had never considered removing. She was not unkind so much as she was organized. The order she had spent her life maintaining was not cruelty. It was architecture, and she simply could not see Eliza without seeing something that did not fit the plan. The ball was at Fairfax House. Eliza attended as Thomas's nominal chaperone, seated along the far wall among the other dependents and attendants, wearing a gown of dove gray that she had retrimmed once already that season. She watched the room fill with silk and candlelight, and the kind of assured motion that comes from never having wondered whether one belongs. She watched the Duke arrive, and move through the crowd with the particular stillness that seems, in a man of his height and rank, less like restraint than like weather. It was there she first heard Dorothea Fairfax's name spoken, as a foregone conclusion. Lady Marian's friend, a narrow woman in rubies whose name Eliza never learned, leaned close to her companion near the fireplace and said, the carrying undertone of a woman who does not consider servants capable of comprehension, the Countess Fairfax. Of course. What else would he do? It has been 4 years. Her companion murmured agreement. The governess, the narrow woman added, with a brief glance toward Eliza's gray gown, is quite adequate, I am sure. Poor creature. Poor creature. Eliza had kept her hands folded in her lap, and her face arranged in the expression of placid attention that she had refined over the weeks at Ashmore Hall. She watched Dorothea Fairfax cross the room, to stand beside the Duke, with the confidence of a woman arriving at a thing already decided. The Countess was everything the season's machinery produced at its most correct. Dark-haired, diamond-collared, with a composure that matched the Duke's own and none of his grief beneath it. She spoke to Edmund in a low voice, and he answered in the short, level sentences that Eliza had come to understand as his primary mode of communication. He did not smile, he did not offer his arm. He did nothing that could be read as reluctance. Eliza turned her eyes to her folded hands and stayed where she was until the carriage was called. She thought that was the whole of the evening's information. She was wrong, in one particular. The Duke had not looked at Dorothea Fairfax when he answered her. He had looked very briefly at the far wall, at the gray gown among the attendants, at nothing, a careful observer might have said. Only a careful observer would have noticed that he looked at the same nothing twice. October arrived, and brought with it cold rain and the first bite of something genuinely wintry in the air off the Ashmore grounds. Thomas came down with the fever that followed every damp English autumn through every nursery in the country. It was the kind of fever that built quietly through the afternoon and turned serious after midnight. And by the time Mrs. Plum came to Eliza's door at 2 a.m, with a candle and a worried expression. Thomas's temperature had climbed high enough to warrant sending for the physician. Lady Marian had been in residence at Ashmore for 4 days by then, ostensibly to consult with Edmund regarding the Fairfax announcement, and it was she who appeared in the schoolroom doorway at 2:30 with an envelope in her hand and the look of a woman who has decided to resolve a complication efficiently. She waited until Mrs. Plum had gone back downstairs for more cold cloths, and then she held out the envelope to Eliza, with the same directness she brought to all her transactions. £100, she said. Your letter of character is already written. There is a household in Bath that requires exactly your qualifications. Eliza was sitting at the head of Thomas's narrow bed, with one of his small hands held between both of hers. His breathing was uneven. The candle on the night table threw a yellow circle against the dark. She looked at the envelope. £100 was more than 2 years of her salary. It was the difference between a rented room in a respectable house and a rented room in a cold one. She understood, with the clear-eyed precision that had served her in every difficult circumstance since her father's death, exactly what Lady Marian was purchasing, and exactly what she was being asked to sell. "No," Eliza said. Lady Marian's posture did not change. "Miss Hartwell, the offer is generous." "It is," Eliza agreed. "Thomas's fever is at its highest point. I will not leave him tonight. I will send Mrs. Plum. Mrs. Plum has the household to manage and a bad knee that prevents her from sitting on low chairs. I will stay." She turned her eyes back to Thomas's face, which was flushed and damp, and very young in the candlelight. "You may leave the envelope if you wish. It will be on your writing table in the morning." Lady Marian stood in the doorway for a moment that stretched considerably longer than was comfortable. Then she withdrew, taking the envelope with her. Eliza did not hear the door open an hour later. She was applying a cold cloth to Thomas's forehead and speaking to him in the low, unhurried voice she used, when he was frightened, telling him about the life cycle of the sycamore seed, which had been the subject of that week's natural history lesson. She did not hear the door. She did not know that the Duke had been awake in the adjoining corridor, called out of his study by some instinct, or by a sound that carried through the old house's walls, and that he stood in the barely open door for a period of time he could not afterward have named, watching his ward's hand held in both of hers, listening to the specific quality of her voice in the dark. He did not come in. He could not have said why. He went back down the corridor and did not sleep again that night. If you have followed Eliza this far, and I suspect you have, it may be worth pausing here, because what happened in those weeks between the fever and the formal announcement has a quality to it that the events themselves do not quite account for. Leave a comment if you already see where this is going, because the story is only halfway told, and the harder half is still ahead. Thomas's fever broke at dawn. By the following afternoon he was sitting up in bed asking for the natural history book, and by the third day he was well enough to be fractious about returning to lessons, which Eliza received as a reliable indicator of health. She brought the book to his bedside and read him the entry on migratory birds, and when she looked up, she found him watching her with an expression that was not quite his default watchfulness. It was something closer to recognition. "You stayed," he said. "Of course," she said. He looked at the window where the October light came in pale and low. "Others have not," he said, which was for Thomas a very long observation. She did not answer immediately. She turned the book's page and found the illustration of the Arctic tern, which she knew he liked. "I am not others," she said. He considered this for a moment, and then, in what constituted, at 7, a declaration of alliance, he said, "No, you are not." The days after that had a different quality. Edmund was present in the house more than he had been. He stopped twice at the schoolroom door at a time when lessons were in progress, and asked Thomas a brief, specific question about what he was learning. He was not demonstrative. He was not, in any way that Eliza could have named as obvious, attentive, and yet she became aware with a discomfort she actively suppressed that he was present in rooms she had not expected him to occupy, asking questions that had no practical purpose, and that his eyes, when they fell on her, remained for a moment past their business. She read each instance through the only framework she possessed: that she was a governess, that she earned £42 a year, that the Countess Fairfax moved through Ashmore Hall with the assurance of a woman measuring a house for new curtains, and that the hierarchy had already rendered its verdict on the question of Eliza Hartwell's place in any room that mattered. She was not wrong to read it that way. She was only wrong about what the reading cost him. Edmund's first wife had been named Catherine. She had come to him with a settled portion and an easy temperament, and a laugh that he had appreciated without adequately attending to. And she had died 4 years before this story takes place in childbed, in the small hours of a March morning, while he was in London attending a treaty negotiation that he had not, in the event, been strictly required to attend. The child had not survived. Thomas had come into his care the following autumn, a small, grieving child, who reflected his own grief back at him in a register he could not reach. He had done what he could. He had hired a series of qualified people to do what he could not. He had made himself useful in the ways that rank permits a man to be useful, and he had decided, with the grim procedural thoroughness that was his primary survival strategy, that he had forfeited the right to want anything. He had looked at Dorothea Fairfax and seen a reasonable arrangement. A woman of suitable station, a managed future. He had not looked more carefully, partly because looking more carefully was a habit he had trained himself out of, and partly because looking more carefully at Countess Fairfax revealed only what was already visible, which was a woman who suited the plan and had no interest in revising it. He did not know, standing in that corridor at 3 in the morning, listening to Eliza's voice in the dark, that something in him had already begun to do the work he had decided not to permit. The formal betrothal announcement came on the 3rd Sunday of October. Lady Marian had arranged a dinner at Ashmore Hall for 22 of the county's most relevant personages, and the Countess Fairfax arrived in a carriage with her own footman and enough jewels to make a statement visible from the far end of the dining table. Eliza had been seated, per her station, at the absolute foot of that table, beside a young clergyman who was earnest and harmless and had nothing to say about natural history. She had eaten the soup and the fish course and was engaged in the poultry when Lady Marian rose and tapped her wine-glass with the edge of a spoon. The announcement took approximately 40 seconds. It was well phrased. Dorothea received the room's approval with a composure that was exactly calibrated to suggest she had expected no other outcome, because she had not. Edmund said nothing beyond what was required of him, and his face remained what it always was, which told Eliza nothing which she had known it would not. The room turned its approval toward the Countess like a flower turning toward the sun. A woman 2 seats from Eliza, wife of a local magistrate, leaned toward her neighbor and said in a voice that assumed governess and furniture to be synonymous, "Poor plain thing. I imagine she will be off to another household by Christmas." Her neighbor murmured sympathetic agreement. "Poor plain thing." Eliza put her fork down. She picked it up again. She finished the poultry course with her face arranged in an expression she had become very practiced at, and she excused herself from the table at the first permissible opportunity on the grounds that she needed to look in on Thomas. Thomas was asleep. She stood in the doorway of his room for a moment, watching the regular rise and fall of his chest, and then she walked to the library. She did not know why, the library. Perhaps because it was the room in the house she had come to think of as genuinely hers, the one room where she had felt something that was not quite belonging, but was at least honest occupation. She had spent enough evenings there after Thomas was in bed reading by the fire in the deep chair that no one else seemed to use, that the room had acquired, despite itself, the quality of a place where she was permitted to be herself. She stood at the writing table for a long moment. The fire had burned down to something low and orange. The room smelled of leather and wood smoke and old paper. She drew off her right glove and laid it on the green leather surface of the desk, with a precision that had something deliberate in it, something that was not resignation, but was adjacent to it. A mark, perhaps. A record that she had been here, that someone had occupied this chair, and loved this fire and read these books, and it had not been no one. Then she pulled on her cloak, picked up her valise, which she had packed before the dinner, and went out through the kitchen door to the hired coach that she had arranged that afternoon. The night was very cold and very clear, and the road to Calne ran through 9 miles of dark Wiltshire countryside, with the stars overhead as indifferent and bright as they had been every other night of her life. She had been on the road for 40 minutes, perhaps a little longer, when she heard hoofbeats. She knew, before she could have explained how she knew, that it was him. The pattern of it, the urgency without panic, the pace that covered ground as though ground were an administrative problem requiring resolution, was entirely consistent with the man she had spent 2 months learning to read. The coach stopped because the rider drew alongside and said once in a voice that carried clearly through the window glass, "Stop the coach." The coachman stopped the coach. Edmund dismounted without giving the appearance of haste and opened the coach door with his own hand, which was not something a duke typically did, and stood in the gap of it looking at Eliza with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It was not his customary stillness. It was what lay underneath the stillness, when the stillness had been removed, which was a controlled and considerable alarm. "You left," he said. "You announced your betrothal," she said. "I was not required past the end of the week in any case. My notice was already prepared." He looked at her for a moment, his hand on the doorframe, the cold air coming in around him. "You left a glove," he said. "I left a glove," she agreed. He reached into his coat pocket and produced it, which meant he had found it in the library and brought it with him, which meant he had gone to the library before he came here, which meant something she did not yet allow herself to calculate. He held it out to her. She did not take it. "Miss Hartwell," he said. And then he stopped, and she had the distinct impression that what he had intended to say and what he was capable of saying in that moment were not the same thing. "Your Grace," she said, "the Countess Fairfax is a suitable match. Lady Marian has made every arrangement. The announcement has been heard by 22 witnesses. I am a governess. The correct course of action is for you to return to your dinner and for me to continue to Kelney." She paused. "This is what is sensible." "I know what is sensible," Edmund said. The word sensible in his mouth had an edge of something that was not quite contempt, but was certainly not approval. "I also know you sat with Thomas for 7 hours in the dark when my mother offered you £100 to go to Bath." Eliza was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Plum told you." "Mrs. Plum told me nothing. My mother told me. She was, I think, proud of the offer rather than ashamed of it." He paused. "Come back to Ashmore Hall." "I cannot come back to Ashmore Hall." "Then come to the Pemberton Hall ball on Friday, and permit me to do something I should have done before any announcement was made." He said it as a statement of fact, in the same register he used when he told Thomas what the next lesson would be, as though the outcome were procedural rather than dependent on her agreement, and she recognized it for what it was, which was the closest he came to asking. She looked at him for a moment in the cold October dark, 9 miles from the house she had left, and whatever lay at the end of this road. Then she took the glove out of his hand, but she did not put it on. She held it. "I will require a reason," she said. Something crossed his face that she could not entirely name. "Because Thomas calls for you when he is ill," he said. "Because the library has been dark for 2 hours and I noticed. Because you did not take the money." He looked at the glove in her hand. "Because I'm a man who has spent 4 years deciding what he has forfeited. And I'm standing in a road in Wiltshire in October, and I do not think the forfeiture was correctly calculated." She held the glove for a long moment. She thought about Thomas's hand in hers. She thought about the library, and the fire, and the deep chair, and all the evenings that had added up, quietly, into something she had not named, because naming it had seemed a luxury too far. She thought about Lady Marian's envelope, and the clean simplicity of the refusal. "Friday," she said. He closed the coach door, remounted, and they went back together through the 9 miles of dark road to Ashmore Hall, the coachman asking no questions and the stars overhead, maintaining their customary silence on the subject. The Pemberton Hall Autumn Ball was the largest social occasion of the county season, attended by every family of standing within 20 miles, and several who had traveled considerably further for the pleasure of being seen attending it. Lady Marian arrived with the Countess Fairfax on her arm, as she had every right to do, and the room received them with the warm recognition it extended to arrangements that confirmed its assumptions. Edmund arrived separately, 15 minutes after the doors opened, and the room turned, as it always did, because rooms containing Edmund Vane always turned when he entered them, whether he wished it or not. Eliza arrived in a gown she had not worn before, a deep blue that was not lavish but was precisely right, and she came in through the main door with her chin at the correct angle, and her gloves on both hands. The cream-colored right glove in its proper place, its pair on her left, and she took her position along the edge of the room where the light was good, and waited. She waited while the Countess moved to Edmund's side, with the smooth assurance of a woman following a choreography she had been rehearsing for months. She waited while Lady Marian scanned the room with the thoroughness of a general confirming the field. She waited while the musicians played and the dancers moved, and the candles held their light above the gathered authority of everything the season had decided. Then Edmund crossed the room. He did not do it gradually. He covered the distance from the far side of the ballroom to the place where she stood in 8 unhurried strides, and the room, which had been doing what rooms do, went quiet, in the particular way that happens when something is occurring that exceeds the evening's agreed-upon script. Dorothea Fairfax's expression shifted very briefly into something that was not quite surprise, because she was too composed for surprise, but was a recognition that the field had changed. Lady Marian went still, her fan held at a precise height, her face unreadable. Edmund stopped in front of Eliza, and he looked at her. And he said, without preamble, without apology, and in a voice that carried to the nearest 8 or 10 pairs of ears without his having raised it, "Miss Hartwell, I find I cannot arrange the rest of my life without your opinion of the matter. I would consider it a very great honor if you would give me the chance to change the arrangement." That was all. It was short and specific, and in front of every person in that room whose verdict had ever been rendered on the subject of Eliza Hartwell, and it landed with the weight of everything it did not say, which was considerable. The room held its breath. Eliza looked at him, at the face she had spent 2 months learning and 1 week trying to forget, and she said, "There are conditions." "Name them," he said. "Thomas stays," she said. "He is not to be sent to school before he is ready. He stays at Ashmore." "He stays," Edmund said without hesitation. "And Mrs. Plum," she said. "She has managed that house for longer than most of its furniture." The corner of his mouth moved, very slightly, in what was either the beginning of a smile or the first real evidence that one was possible. "Mrs. Plum is entirely immovable," he said. "She has made this clear on multiple occasions." "Then we are in agreement," Eliza said. She took his offered arm. The room breathed out. It did so in the specific way that rooms do when the hierarchy has been overridden by something the hierarchy has to recognize as legitimate, because the man performing the override is the most senior person in the room. Dorothea Fairfax's fan was raised to its proper height, and her chin lifted a precise 1/4 inch, which was what composure looked like when it was doing the very hardest work of its life. She departed the floor without anything that could be called a scene. She was too well bred for a scene. And the evening, she could see, was no longer hers. Lady Marian Vane stood for a moment at the edge of the gathered room without moving. Her fan was still. Her jewels caught the candlelight. She looked at her son's hand on Eliza's arm, and then she looked at Eliza's face, and something moved behind her eyes that might have been the specific weight of knowing that the woman standing beside her son could have taken 100 pounds in October, and had not. That was a kind of worth the architecture of rank had no ready category for, and Lady Marian was a woman of sufficient intelligence to recognize when a category had failed her. She said nothing. She turned and left the ballroom with her head at its correct angle, and that silence was, in its way, more complete than any concession she might have spoken. The room, having witnessed what it needed to witness, returned to its music. Outside the Pemberton Hall windows, the first real cold of November had arrived in the dark while the candles burned inside. Eliza did not know it yet. She was standing in a ballroom with the Duke of Ashmore's hand over hers, and the room was moving around her in its warm light, and for the first time in a very long time, the evening's verdict was not about her unworthiness, but about something else entirely. The snow came to Ashmore Hall in the first week of December, which was earlier than usual, and settled more thoroughly than anyone had planned for, covering the kitchen garden and the front drive and the great oaks along the east wall in a quiet that made the house feel both smaller and more itself. Mrs. Plum, whose knee had been bothering her since the cold set in, stood at the kitchen window with a cup of something hot, and looked at the white grounds with the expression of a woman who has spent 30 years managing the unexpected and has learned to receive good news with caution. Thomas was at the piano in the morning room, working his way through a simple piece that Eliza had been teaching him for 3 weeks. He was not precise, and he did not much mind being imprecise, which was in itself a development that Mrs. Sa. Plum registered with the private relief of someone who has watched a child, locked inside his own quiet, for too long. The notes came out uneven and earnest, and at one point Thomas played the same bar 4 times until he found the correct fingering. And then he played it a 5th time just because he could. And then he laughed, which was a sound that had been very rare in that house for 4 years, and was not rare anymore. Eliza stood at the library window. The fire was burning steadily behind her, and the room smelled of wood smoke and old leather. And outside the window the snow came down in the particular way it does in Wiltshire, in early December, which is steadily and without drama, as though it has all the time in the world. She held the glove in her right hand, not wearing it, just holding it, turning it between her fingers the way one handles a thing that has become a kind of record. It was still cream-colored. It still fit. Edmund came in without announcing himself, which she had learned was his primary method of entering rooms. He stood beside her at the window for a moment, looking at the snow falling on the grounds that were now hers as much as his, or would be by Thursday, when the vicar was coming. "He is playing better," Edmund said. "He played that same bar 4 times in succession," Eliza said. "He is being thorough." "A family trait," Edmund said, and that was the whole of the joke, delivered in the dry, level voice that was his particular register for the rarest category of utterance, and it was. In its economy and its warmth, more than enough. She turned to look at him, this man who had stood in a road in Wiltshire holding a glove and offered her a reckoning instead of a rescue, and she thought about what it cost a person to rebuild the habit of wanting after 4 years of deliberate renunciation. And she thought it was probably about the same as what it cost a person to refuse £100 in the dark, on the grounds that a feverish child needed someone to stay. She put the glove on. The right glove. Precisely fitted, as it had always been. From the morning room, 3 notes came in uncertain succession, and then Thomas found the 4th, and then his laughter followed it down the corridor, and under the library door, and into the room where the fire burned, and the snow fell, and the Duke of Ashmore stood beside the woman who had not taken the money. She was home. If Eliza's story moved you, leave a thought in the comments about the moment that stayed with you. There are more stories like this one waiting, and every comment finds them for someone new.